I wanna go. I wanna go.
Quiero ir.
I wanna go.
I wanna go.
Let's go there. Let's go there.
Vamos allí.
Let's go there.
Let's go there.
She came back. She came back.
Ella regresó.
She came back.
She came back.
I need help. I need help.
Necesito ayuda.
I need help.
I need help.
Do it now. Do it now.
Hazlo ahora.
Do it now.
Do it now.
Stop the car. Stop the car.
Detén el coche.
Stop the car.
Stop the car.
They walked away. They walked away.
Ellos se alejaron.
They walked away.
They walked away.
Let's try again. Let's try again.
Intentemos de nuevo.
Let's try again.
Let's try again.
He called me. He called me.
Él me llamó.
He called me.
He called me.
I told you. I told you.
Te lo dije.
I told you.
I told you.
It feels cold. It feels cold.
Se siente frío.
It feels cold.
It feels cold.
I stayed home. I stayed home.
Me quedé en casa.
I stayed home.
I stayed home.
He ran fast. He ran fast.
Él corrió rápido.
He ran fast.
He ran fast.
She danced well. She danced well.
Ella bailó bien.
She danced well.
She danced well.
I brought it. I brought it.
Lo traje.
I brought it.
I brought it.
We waited long. We waited long.
Esperamos mucho.
We waited long.
We waited long.
She smiled softly. She smiled softly.
Ella sonrió suavemente.
She smiled softly.
She smiled softly.
He made dinner. He made dinner.
Él preparó la cena.
He made dinner.
He made dinner.
I studied hard. I studied hard.
Estudié mucho.
I studied hard.
I studied hard.
We worked together. We worked together.
Trabajamos juntos.
We worked together.
We worked together.
They looked tired. They looked tired.
Ellos se veían cansados.
They looked tired.
They looked tired.
I saw her. I saw her.
La vi.
I saw her.
I saw her.
She helped me. She helped me.
Ella me ayudó.
She helped me.
She helped me.
Let's find it. Let's find it.
Vamos a encontrarlo.
Let's find it.
Let's find it.
I cleaned up. I cleaned up.
Limpié todo.
I cleaned up.
I cleaned up.
He drove slowly. He drove slowly.
Él condujo lentamente.
He drove slowly.
He drove slowly.
We sang loudly. We sang loudly.
Cantamos en voz alta.
We sang loudly.
We sang loudly.
I cried yesterday. I cried yesterday.
Lloré ayer.
I cried yesterday.
I cried yesterday.
They laughed hard. They laughed hard.
Ellos rieron mucho.
They laughed hard.
They laughed hard.
She bought it. She bought it.
Ella lo compró.
She bought it.
She bought it.
He played well. He played well.
Él jugó bien.
He played well.
He played well.
I heard that. I heard that.
Escuché eso.
I heard that.
I heard that.
We met yesterday. We met yesterday.
Nos encontramos ayer.
We met yesterday.
We met yesterday.
She stayed late. She stayed late.
Ella se quedó hasta tarde.
She stayed late.
She stayed late.
He opened it. He opened it.
Él lo abrió.
He opened it.
He opened it.
They forgot me. They forgot me.
Ellos se olvidaron de mí.
They forgot me.
They forgot me.
We talked a lot. We talked a lot.
Hablamos mucho.
We talked a lot.
We talked a lot.
He waited patiently. He waited patiently.
Él esperó pacientemente.
He waited patiently.
He waited patiently.
She fixed it. She fixed it.
Ella lo arregló.
She fixed it.
She fixed it.
They walked away. They walked away.
Ellos se alejaron.
They walked away.
They walked away.
I felt happy. I felt happy.
Me sentí feliz.
I felt happy.
I felt happy.
We shared food. We shared food.
Compartimos comida.
We shared food.
We shared food.
He read quickly. He read quickly.
Él leyó rápidamente.
He read quickly.
He read quickly.
She painted beautifully. She painted beautifully.
Ella pintó hermosamente.
She painted beautifully.
She painted beautifully.
I left early. I left early.
Me fui temprano.
I left early.
I left early.
They joined us. They joined us.
Se unieron a nosotros.
They joined us.
They joined us.
I tried hard. I tried hard.
Lo intenté mucho.
I tried hard.
I tried hard.
He missed her. He missed her.
Él la extrañó.
He missed her.
He missed her.
She drank tea. She drank tea.
Ella tomó té.
She drank tea.
She drank tea.
We learned it. We learned it.
Aprendimos eso.
We learned it.
We learned it.
I worked late. I worked late.
Trabajé hasta tarde.
I worked late.
I worked late.
He built that. He built that.
Él construyó eso.
He built that.
He built that.
She baked cookies. She baked cookies.
Ella horneó galletas.
She baked cookies.
She baked cookies.
They stayed long. They stayed long.
Ellos se quedaron mucho tiempo.
They stayed long.
They stayed long.
I found it. I found it.
Lo encontré.
I found it.
I found it.
We talked more. We talked more.
Hablamos más.
We talked more.
We talked more.
She kissed him. She kissed him.
Ella lo besó.
She kissed him.
She kissed him.
He stayed quiet. He stayed quiet.
Él se quedó callado.
He stayed quiet.
He stayed quiet.
I walked away. I walked away.
Me alejé.
I walked away.
I walked away.
They waited patiently. They waited patiently.
Ellos esperaron pacientemente.
They waited patiently.
They waited patiently.
I ate lunch. I ate lunch.
Almorcé.
I ate lunch.
I ate lunch.
We loved that. We loved that.
Nos encantó eso.
We love that.
We loved that.
She hugged me. She hugged me.
Ella me abrazó.
She hugged me.
She hugged me.
He finished early. He finished early.
Él terminó temprano.
He finished early.
He finished early.
They left quickly. They left quickly.
Ellos se fueron rápido.
They left quickly.
They left quickly.
I traveled far. I traveled far.
Viajé lejos.
I traveled far.
I traveled far.
We watched TV. We watched TV.
Vimos televisión.
We watched TV.
We watched TV.
She cared deeply. She cared deeply.
Ella se preocupó profundamente.
She cared deeply.
She cared deeply.
He worried less. He worried less.
Él se preocupó menos.
He worried less.
He worried less.
They arrived late. They arrived late.
Ellos llegaron tarde.
They arrived late.
They arrived late.
I baked bread. I baked bread.
Horneé pan.
I baked bread.
I baked bread.
He cried softly. He cried softly.
Él lloró suavemente.
He cried softly.
He cried softly.
She learned fast. She learned fast.
Ella aprendió rápido.
She learned fast.
She learned fast.
We helped out. We helped out.
Ayudamos.
We helped out.
We helped out.
They planned well. They planned well.
Ellos planearon bien.
They planned well.
They planned well.
I listened carefully. I listened carefully.
Escuché atentamente.
I listened carefully.
I listened carefully.
He yelled loudly. He yelled loudly.
Él gritó fuerte.
He yelled loudly.
He yelled loudly.
She drew beautifully. She drew beautifully.
Ella dibujó hermosamente.
She drew beautifully.
She drew beautifully.
We agreed quickly. We agreed quickly.
Acordamos rápido.
We agreed quickly.
We agreed quickly.
I smiled back. I smiled back.
Sonreí de vuelta.
I smiled back.
I smiled back.
They apologized sincerely. They apologized sincerely.
Se disculparon sinceramente.
They apologized sincerely.
They apologized sincerely.
She arrived early. She arrived early.
Ella llegó temprano.
She arrived early.
She arrived early.
He worked hard. He worked hard.
Él trabajó duro.
He worked hard.
He worked hard.
I missed you. I missed you.
Te extrañé.
I missed you.
I missed you.
We walked outside. We walked outside.
Caminamos afuera.
We walked outside.
We walked outside.
They traveled together. They traveled together.
Viajaron juntos.
They traveled together.
They traveled together.
She thought deeply. She thought deeply.
Ella pensó profundamente.
She thought deeply.
She thought deeply.
He looked tired. He looked tired.
Él se veía cansado.
He looked tired.
He looked tired.
I left quickly. I left quickly.
Me fui rápido.
I left quickly.
I left quickly.
They talked quietly. They talked quietly.
Hablaron en voz baja.
They talked quietly.
They talked quietly.
She loved him. She loved him.
Ella lo amó.
She loved him.
She loved him.
He answered calmly. He answered calmly.
Él respondió con calma.
He answered calmly.
He answered calmly.
I cried alone. I cried alone.
Lloré solo.
I cried alone.
I cried alone.
We met yesterday. We met yesterday.
Nos conocimos ayer.
We met yesterday.
We met yesterday.
She cleaned up. She cleaned up.
Ella limpió todo.
She cleaned up.
She cleaned up.
He waited longer. He waited longer.
Él esperó más tiempo.
He waited longer.
He waited longer.
They forgot quickly. They forgot quickly.
Ellos se olvidaron rápido.
They forgot quickly.
They forgot quickly.
I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that.
Disfruté eso.
I enjoyed that.
I enjoyed that.
She danced beautifully. She danced beautifully.
Ella bailó hermosamente.
She danced beautifully.
She danced beautifully.
He arrived late. He arrived late.
Él llegó tarde.
He arrived late.
He arrived late.
We tried everything. We tried everything.
Intentamos todo.
We tried everything.
We tried everything.
They bought snacks. They bought snacks.
Ellos compraron bocadillos.
They bought snacks.
They bought snacks.
I called home. I called home.
Llamé a casa.
I called home.
I called home.
She worried deeply. She worried deeply.
Ella se preocupó profundamente.
She worried deeply.
She worried deeply.
He hugged her. He hugged her.
Él la abrazó.
He hugged her.
He hugged her.
I missed work. I missed work.
Me perdí el trabajo.
I missed work.
I missed work.
They sang loudly. They sang loudly.
Cantaron en voz alta.
They sang loudly.
They sang loudly.
We cooked dinner. We cooked dinner.
Cocinamos la cena.
We cooked dinner.
We cooked dinner.
I explained briefly. I explained briefly.
Expliqué brevemente.
I explained briefly.
I explained briefly.
She relaxed quietly. She relaxed quietly.
Ella se relajó en silencio.
She relaxed quietly.
She relaxed quietly.
He studied late. He studied late.
Él estudió hasta tarde.
He studied late.
He studied late.
We found out. We found out.
Descubrimos algo.
We found out.
We found out.
I joined them. I joined them.
Me uní a ellos.
I joined them.
I joined them.
She stayed awake. She stayed awake.
Ella se mantuvo despierta.
She stayed awake.
She stayed awake.
They laughed loudly. They laughed loudly.
Ellos rieron fuerte.
They laughed loudly.
They laughed loudly.
He helped more. He helped more.
Él ayudó más.
He helped more.
He helped more.
I forgot completely. I forgot completely.
Olvidé completamente.
I forgot completely.
I forgot completely.
We tried again. We tried again.
Lo intentamos de nuevo.
We tried again.
We tried again.
She painted better. She painted better.
Ella pintó mejor.
She painted better.
She painted better.
He shared food. He shared food.
Él compartió comida.
He shared food.
He shared food.
They traveled often. They traveled often.
Viajaron a menudo.
They traveled often.
They traveled often.
I cleaned everything. I cleaned everything.
Limpié todo.
I cleaned everything.
I cleaned everything.
She hugged tightly. She hugged tightly.
Ella abrazó fuertemente.
She hugged tightly.
She hugged tightly.
He worked harder. He worked harder.
Él trabajó más duro.
He worked harder.
He worked harder.
They waited longer. They waited longer.
Ellos esperaron más tiempo.
They waited longer.
They waited longer.
I felt sad. I felt sad.
Me sentí triste.
I felt sad.
I felt sad.
She apologized softly. She apologized softly.
Ella se disculpó suavemente.
She apologized softly.
She apologized softly.
He ran quickly. He ran quickly.
Él corrió rápido.
He ran quickly.
He ran quickly.
They stayed overnight. They stayed overnight.
Se quedaron toda la noche.
They stayed overnight.
They stayed overnight.
We watched closely. We watched closely.
Observamos de cerca.
We watched closely.
We watched closely.
I laughed hard. I laughed hard.
Me reí mucho.
I laughed hard.
I laughed hard.
She sang quietly. She sang quietly.
Ella cantó en voz baja.
She sang quietly.
She sang quietly.
He looked carefully. He looked carefully.
Él miró cuidadosamente.
He looked carefully.
He looked carefully.
They planned quickly. They planned quickly.
Planearon rápidamente.
They planned quickly.
They planned quickly.
I waited longer. I waited longer.
Esperé más tiempo.
I waited longer.
I waited longer.
She studied hard. She studied hard.
Ella estudió mucho.
She studied hard.
She studied hard.
He finished fast. He finished fast.
Él terminó rápido.
He finished fast.
He finished fast.
They walked slowly. They walked slowly.
Ellos caminaron despacio.
They walked slowly.
They walked slowly.
I helped out. I helped out.
Ayudé un poco.
I helped out.
I helped out.
She learned faster. She learned faster.
Ella aprendió más rápido.
She learned faster.
She learned faster.
He tried hard. He tried hard.
Él lo intentó mucho.
He tried hard.
He tried hard.
We enjoyed more. We enjoyed more.
Disfrutamos más.
We enjoyed more.
We enjoyed more.
I stayed longer. I stayed longer.
Me quedé más tiempo.
I stayed longer.
I stayed longer.
She answered quickly. She answered quickly.
Ella respondió rápido.
She answered quickly.
She answered quickly.
He yelled louder. He yelled louder.
Él gritó más fuerte.
He yelled louder.
He yelled louder.
They apologized sincerely. They apologized sincerely.
Se disculparon sinceramente.
They apologized sincerely.
They apologized sincerely.
I ran faster. I ran faster.
Corrí más rápido.
I ran faster.
I ran faster.
We cooked better. We cooked better.
Cocinamos mejor.
We cooked better.
We cooked better.
She cared deeply. She cared deeply.
Ella se preocupó profundamente.
She cared deeply.
She cared deeply.
He relaxed quickly. He relaxed quickly.
Él se relajó rápido.
He relaxed quickly.
He relaxed quickly.
I traveled alone. I traveled alone.
Viajé solo.
I traveled alone.
I traveled alone.
They learned slowly. They learned slowly.
Ellos aprendieron lentamente.
They learned slowly.
They learned slowly.
We agreed early. We agreed early.
Acordamos temprano.
We agreed early.
We agreed early.
I worried less. I worried less.
Me preocupé menos.
I worried less.
I worried less.
She smiled softly. She smiled softly.
Ella sonrió suavemente.
She smiled softly.
She smiled softly.
He played well. He played well.
Él jugó bien.
He played well.
He played well.
They built fast. They built fast.
Ellos construyeron rápido.
They built fast.
They built fast.
I thought quickly. I thought quickly.
Pensé rápidamente.
I thought quickly.
I thought quickly.
She forgot nothing. She forgot nothing.
Ella no olvidó nada.
She forgot nothing.
She forgot nothing.
He worked overtime. He worked overtime.
Él trabajó horas extra.
He worked overtime.
He worked overtime.
We stayed late. We stayed late.
Nos quedamos hasta tarde.
We stayed late.
We stayed late.
They helped willingly. They helped willingly.
Ayudaron de buena gana.
They helped willingly.
They helped willingly.
I called again. I called again.
Llamé de nuevo.
I called again.
I called again.
She cried quietly. She cried quietly.
Ella lloró en silencio.
She cried quietly.
She cried quietly.
He hugged back. He hugged back.
Él abrazó de vuelta.
He hugged back.
He hugged back.
We laughed harder. We laughed harder.
Nos reímos más fuerte.
We laughed harder.
We laughed harder.
I smiled briefly. I smiled briefly.
Sonreí brevemente.
I smiled briefly.
I smiled briefly.
They planned better. They planned better.
Ellos planearon mejor.
They planned better.
They planned better.
She listened carefully. She listened carefully.
Ella escuchó con atención.
She listened carefully.
She listened carefully.
He worked harder. He worked harder.
Él trabajó más duro.
He worked harder.
He worked harder.
I traveled further. I traveled further.
Viajé más lejos.
I traveled further.
I traveled further.
We talked more. We talked more.
Hablamos más.
We talked more.
We talked more.
They worried often. They worried often.
Ellos se preocuparon con frecuencia.
They worried often.
They worried often.
She hugged tightly. She hugged tightly.
Ella abrazó con fuerza.
She hugged tightly.
She hugged tightly.
He ran faster. He ran faster.
Él corrió más rápido.
He ran faster.
He ran faster.
I waited patiently. I waited patiently.
Esperé pacientemente.
I waited patiently.
I waited patiently.
We walked together. We walked together.
Caminamos juntos.
We walked together.
We walked together.
She learned slower. She learned slower.
Ella aprendió más despacio.
She learned slower.
She learned slower.
He cooked faster. He cooked faster.
Él cocinó más rápido.
He cooked faster.
He cooked faster.
They laughed together. They laughed together.
Ellos se rieron juntos.
They laughed together.
They laughed together.
I built carefully. I built carefully.
Construí con cuidado.
I built carefully.
I built carefully.
She helped kindly. She helped kindly.
Ella ayudó amablemente.
She helped kindly.
She helped kindly.
He stayed calm. He stayed calm.
Él se mantuvo tranquilo.
He stayed calm.
He stayed calm.
They danced beautifully. They danced beautifully.
Ellos bailaron hermosamente.
They danced beautifully.
They danced beautifully.
I watched closely. I watched closely.
Observé de cerca.
I watched closely.
I watched closely.
She worked longer. She worked longer.
Ella trabajó más tiempo.
She worked longer.
She worked longer.
He yelled louder. He yelled louder.
Él gritó más fuerte.
He yelled louder.
He yelled louder.
We smiled often. We smiled often.
Sonreímos con frecuencia.
We smiled often.
We smiled often.
They called home. They called home.
Llamaron a casa.
They called home.
They called home.
I loved deeply. I loved deeply.
Amé profundamente.
I loved deeply.
I loved deeply.
She painted calmly. She painted calmly.
Ella pintó con calma.
She painted calmly.
She painted calmly.
He thought quickly. He thought quickly.
Él pensó rápidamente.
He thought quickly.
He thought quickly.
We cried together. We cried together.
Lloramos juntos.
We cried together.
We cried together.
They cleaned everything. They cleaned everything.
Ellos limpiaron todo.
They cleaned everything.
They cleaned everything.
I waited longer. I waited longer.
Esperé más tiempo.
I waited longer.
I waited longer.
She relaxed deeply. She relaxed deeply.
Ella se relajó profundamente.
She relaxed deeply.
She relaxed deeply.
He worried slightly. He worried slightly.
Él se preocupó ligeramente.
He worried slightly.
He worried slightly.
We worked hard. We worked hard.
Trabajamos duro.
We worked hard.
We worked hard.
They tried harder. They tried harder.
Ellos lo intentaron más.
They tried harder.
They tried harder.
I learned slowly. I learned slowly.
Aprendí lentamente.
I learned slowly.
I learned slowly.
She walked quickly. She walked quickly.
Ella caminó rápido.
She walked quickly.
She walked quickly.
He played better. He played better.
Él jugó mejor.
He played better.
He played better.
They ran faster. They ran faster.
Ellos corrieron más rápido.
They ran faster.
They ran faster.
I stayed longer. I stayed longer.
Me quedé más tiempo.
I stayed longer.
I stayed longer.
We talked loudly. We talked loudly.
Hablamos en voz alta.
We talked loudly.
We talked loudly.
She smiled brightly. She smiled brightly.
Ella sonrió brillantemente.
She smiled brightly.
She smiled brightly.
He worked quietly. He worked quietly.
Él trabajó en silencio.
He worked quietly.
He worked quietly.
They cried softly. They cried softly.
Ellos lloraron suavemente.
They cried softly.
They cried softly.
I helped again. I helped again.
Ayudé de nuevo.
I helped again.
I helped again.
She thought carefully. She thought carefully.
Ella pensó cuidadosamente.
She thought carefully.
She thought carefully.
He called often. He called often.
Él llamó con frecuencia.
He called often.
He called often.
We cooked together. We cooked together.
Cocinamos juntos.
We cooked together.
We cooked together.
They danced slowly. They danced slowly.
Ellos bailaron despacio.
They danced slowly.
They danced slowly.
I cleaned properly. I cleaned properly.
Limpié correctamente.
I cleaned properly.
I cleaned properly.
She hugged warmly. She hugged warmly.
Ella abrazó cálidamente.
She hugged warmly.
She hugged warmly.
He yelled angrily. He yelled angrily.
Él gritó con enojo.
He yelled angrily.
He yelled angrily.
They smiled gently. They smiled gently.
Ellos sonrieron amablemente.
They smiled gently.
They smiled gently.
I waited calmly. I waited calmly.
Esperé con calma.
I waited calmly.
I waited calmly.
She studied harder. She studied harder.
Ella estudió más duro.
She studied harder.
She studied harder.
He learned quickly. He learned quickly.
Él aprendió rápido.
He learned quickly.
He learned quickly.
They traveled widely. They traveled widely.
Ellos viajaron ampliamente.
They traveled widely.
They traveled widely.
We agreed instantly. We agreed instantly.
Acordamos instantáneamente.
We agreed instantly.
We agreed instantly.
I stayed outside. I stayed outside.
Me quedé afuera.
I stayed outside.
I stayed outside.
She painted clearly. She painted clearly.
Ella pintó claramente.
She painted clearly.
She painted clearly.
He cooked carefully. He cooked carefully.
Él cocinó cuidadosamente.
He cooked carefully.
He cooked carefully.
They helped eagerly. They helped eagerly.
Ellos ayudaron con entusiasmo.
They helped eagerly.
They helped eagerly.
I watched everything. I watched everything.
Miré todo.
I watched everything.
I watched everything.
She hugged often. She hugged often.
Ella abrazó con frecuencia.
She hugged often.
She hugged often.
He ran farther. He ran farther.
Él corrió más lejos.
He ran farther.
He ran farther.
We planned ahead. We planned ahead.
Planeamos con anticipación.
We planned ahead.
We planned ahead.
They smiled kindly. They smiled kindly.
Ellos sonrieron amablemente.
They smiled kindly.
They smiled kindly.
I worked faster. I worked faster.
Trabajé más rápido.
I worked faster.
I worked faster.
She laughed harder. She laughed harder.
Ella se rió más fuerte.
She laughed harder.
She laughed harder.
He thought deeply. He thought deeply.
Él pensó profundamente.
He thought deeply.
He thought deeply.
They cleaned faster. They cleaned faster.
Ellos limpiaron más rápido.
They cleaned faster.
They cleaned faster.
I talked quickly. I talked quickly.
Hablé rápido.
I talked quickly.
I talked quickly.
She built neatly. She built neatly.
Ella construyó ordenadamente.
She built neatly.
She built neatly.
He listened well. He listened well.
Él escuchó bien.
He listened well.
He listened well.
We laughed quietly. We laughed quietly.
Nos reímos en silencio.
We laughed quietly.
We laughed quietly.
They cried deeply. They cried deeply.
Ellos lloraron profundamente.
They cried deeply.
They cried deeply.
I waited longer. I waited longer.
Esperé más tiempo.
I waited longer.
I waited longer.
She cooked patiently. She cooked patiently.
Ella cocinó pacientemente.
She cooked patiently.
She cooked patiently.
He painted beautifully. He painted beautifully.
Él pintó hermosamente.
He painted beautifully.
He painted beautifully.
They played softly. They played softly.
Ellos jugaron suavemente.
They played softly.
They played softly.
I stayed nearby. I stayed nearby.
Me quedé cerca.
I stayed nearby.
I stayed nearby.
She hugged sweetly. She hugged sweetly.
Ella abrazó dulcemente.
She hugged sweetly.
She hugged sweetly.
He worked overtime. He worked overtime.
Él trabajó horas extra.
He worked overtime.
He worked overtime.
They traveled safely. They traveled safely.
Ellos viajaron con seguridad.
They traveled safely.
They traveled safely.
I studied harder. I studied harder.
Estudié más duro.
I studied harder.
I studied harder.
She smiled more. She smiled more.
Ella sonrió más.
She smiled more.
She smiled more.
He built quickly. He built quickly.
Él construyó rápido.
He built quickly.
He built quickly.
We tried harder. We tried harder.
Lo intentamos más.
We tried harder.
We tried harder.
They agreed happily. They agreed happily.
Ellos acordaron felices.
They agreed happily.
They agreed happily.
I forgot something. I forgot something.
Olvidé algo.
I forgot something.
I forgot something.
She painted softly. She painted softly.
Ella pintó suavemente.
She painted softly.
She painted softly.
He hugged tightly. He hugged tightly.
Él abrazó con fuerza.
He hugged tightly.
He hugged tightly.
They planned better. They planned better.
Ellos planearon mejor.
They planned better.
They planned better.
We smiled longer. We smiled longer.
Sonreímos más tiempo.
We smiled longer.
We smiled longer.
I learned faster. I learned faster.
Aprendí más rápido.
I learned faster.
I learned faster.
She stayed inside. She stayed inside.
Ella se quedó dentro.
She stayed inside.
She stayed inside.
He danced nicely. He danced nicely.
Él bailó bien.
He danced nicely.
He danced nicely.
They walked farther. They walked farther.
Ellos caminaron más lejos.
They walked farther.
They walked farther.
I cleaned again. I cleaned again.
Limpié de nuevo.
I cleaned again.
I cleaned again.
She helped often. She helped often.
Ella ayudó con frecuencia.
She helped often.
She helped often.
He listened closely. He listened closely.
Él escuchó de cerca.
He listened closely.
He listened closely.
They traveled far. They traveled far.
Ellos viajaron lejos.
They traveled far.
They traveled far.
We cooked better. We cooked better.
Cocinamos mejor.
We cooked better.
We cooked better.
She worked faster. She worked faster.
Ella trabajó más rápido.
She worked faster.
She worked faster.
I smiled warmly. I smiled warmly.
Sonreí cálidamente.
I smiled warmly.
I smiled warmly.
They danced together. They danced together.
Ellos bailaron juntos.
They danced together.
They danced together.